Hey, Brian. Thank you very much. We have a very big announcement to make today. You all know Johnny. He came all the way from Italy, the beautiful country of Italy, to be with us. And he just got off the plane, and he's a hardworking guy, does a phenomenal job with FIFA. Nobody like him. I'm delighted to welcome FIFA President Gianni Infantino back to the White House for a major announcement about one of the most anticipated competitions in all of sports, the 2026, and this is a big deal, I'll tell you, I was so happy to get it, the 2026 FIFA World Cup. And it's going to be the World Cup as we know it. It's the biggest, probably the biggest event in sports, I guess, Johnny, right?
Not long ago, it became known that Trump said words to Putin during their latest talks that could change the balance of power in the world. A diplomatic scandal is unfolding before the eyes of the entire world. The former president's remarks sounded like an ultimatum, wrapped in veiled hints, but their meaning was clear to anyone following the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. He declared that within 2 weeks he would make a very important decision if the crisis could not be resolved. This decision, he said, might include massive sanctions or massive tariffs, or both, or nothing. And then, as if deliberately emphasizing his personal control over the situation, he added, "I will see whose fault it is. If there's a reason for it, I'll know. I know exactly what I'm doing." The statement was not made at a dry press conference or in a narrow circle of advisers, but against a carefully chosen visual symbol, a joint photograph with Vladimir Putin. In it, the Russian president looked, according to Trump, very good, while the American leader himself looked normal. This comment, seemingly humorous at first glance, instantly spread through the media, taking on a hidden political undertone. Insiders familiar with Trump's style insist that such remarks are codes addressed to those capable of deciphering them, and this time they allegedly referred not only to foreign policy, but also to personal arrangements of which the public can only guess. The context in which these words were spoken was electrified. In recent weeks, the Washington-Moscow diplomatic channels had been working at their limits. After the failure of the July consultations in Vienna, where the parties failed to agree on the basic parameters of a ceasefire, rumors multiplied in the corridors of power about a planned high-level meeting. European diplomats, including from Berlin and Paris, tried to play the role of intermediaries, but all efforts ran into the absence of direct contact between the leaders. And now Trump publicly claimed that he personally told the parties to meet, and that he would judge the situation based on whether this meeting took place. The global media reacted instantly. Some spoke of a new attempt by Trump to reclaim the status of a global peacemaker. Others, of a subtle blackmail aimed at both sides of the conflict at once. Newspapers in London ran headlines about an unpredictable American line. Parisian outlets warned of a possible trade tsunami. And in Kyiv, leading news channels argued live whether this amounted to a de facto ultimatum to Ukraine. In Moscow, officials confined themselves to brief comments emphasizing openness to dialogue. But Kremlin political analysts privately admitted Trump's signal was taken seriously. In parallel with the official versions, speculation multiplied rapidly in expert circles and on social media. Some analysts claimed that this was preparation for an unprecedented package of economic measures against Russia, comparable to those once imposed on Iran. Others suggested that by massive tariffs, Trump meant not only trade restrictions, but also targeted strikes at logistics chains affecting energy exports. Whispered in the corridors was an even more sensational theory, that behind the words "nothing" could lie a pause agreed with Putin, advantageous to both sides for implementing hidden arrangements. Observers in Washington stressed that the very mention of a 2-week deadline was not just flashy rhetoric. Internal sources in the Republican Party hinted that Trump intended to demonstrate his ability to swiftly and harshly influence global processes, reminding his opponents in the U.S. that it was he, not the current administration, who could decide the fate of the world. For American domestic politics, this statement was a loud shot in the middle of election season, when every day counts and every high-profile news hook can change the course of the campaign. On Capitol Hill, it sparked lively discussion. Democratic members of Congress, while avoiding sharp wording, nevertheless pointed out that such threats of sanctions or tariffs against Russia without coordination with allies could harm the economic interests of the United States itself. At the same time, Trump's supporters insisted this was the only way to force the parties to the conflict to sit down at the negotiating table. He knows how to make deals, they said, recalling his past initiatives in the Middle East. Meanwhile, in Europe, the mood was far more anxious. The Brussels diplomatic corps openly feared that the new American line could collapse the fragile balance in relations with Moscow and Kyiv. Sources in the European Commission admitted that a sharp increase in tariff pressure from the US could trigger economic turbulence, especially against the backdrop of energy instability. In Berlin, senior officials noted that Europe had no resources to offset potential losses if a trade war between Washington and Moscow erupted amid the ongoing conflict. Against this backdrop, public attention increasingly focused on Trump's enigmatic remark, "I will see whose fault it is." For many, this phrase became the key to understanding his intentions. Political analysts tried to determine exactly whom he was hinting at: the Russian leadership, Ukrainian leaders, or perhaps European intermediaries who had failed to establish direct dialogue. Several influential American outlets even suggested that Trump was ready to use this moment for an internal attack on the White House, blaming the sitting president for failed peace efforts. In Moscow, the reaction was mixed. On the one hand, officials tried to display calm, stressing that Russia was ready for talks in any format. On the other, sources close to the foreign ministry said that several scenarios of countermeasures were being considered in case of new sanctions. One scenario involved temporarily reducing diplomatic contacts and accelerating work on alternative trade routes through Asian countries. According to one source, the Kremlin was also closely studying the internal political landscape in the US to assess whether Trump could actually deliver on his threats. Insiders close to the former president's team claimed that behind the scenes, consultations were already underway with major business structures that could be affected by sharp changes in trade policy. Trump was reportedly demanding party allies' support in case measures had to be introduced that might hit U.S. corporations involved in technology and agricultural exports. For him, sources say, the move had both foreign and domestic dimensions, a demonstration that he was willing to take risks for a greater goal. Beyond official statements, a much more complex and dangerous game was taking shape. Those familiar with the logic of high-level negotiations claimed that the 2-week deadline Trump named coincided with a series of unofficial meetings in European capitals, about which nothing was said in public. In UN corridors, NATO headquarters offices, and the halls of private clubs in London and Zurich, movements of political figures were being tracked, figures whose visits never made the press. This was the invisible layer of diplomacy, where issues are decided not through loud speeches but through signals, codes, and promises given without witnesses. In Paris, a former advisor to the French president, speaking only on condition of anonymity, hinted that Trump had allegedly received preliminary consent from Putin for a personal meeting on the condition that the U.S. postpone a new sanctions package. According to this version, the former American leader's public threat was not a spontaneous gesture, but a carefully calculated bargaining chip, where every phrase and pause had a price. But in Washington, it was already known that not everyone in the Kremlin supported such a line, and that divisions were brewing within the Russian elite over how far Putin could trust Trump's promises. Global markets reacted instantly to the spike in uncertainty. On currency exchanges, the euro and dollar showed jittery dynamics, while energy company stocks surged and fell in response to each new rumor from Washington or Moscow. In business circles in New York and London, a sense was growing that this was not just another round of trade disputes, but an event with a chain reaction effect, capable of disrupting logistics, financial flows, and even structures of international credit. Some analysts, in private reports to clients, were already calling it the prologue to the economic storm of the decade. In Kyiv, the reaction was emotional and varied. Some government officials publicly expressed cautious hope that Trump's words might push Moscow toward constructive dialogue. But in closed meetings, concerns were increasingly voiced. If the former U.S. president decided that the blame lay with Ukraine, it could mean reduced support and increased pressure from Western partners. One MP told reporters the situation looked like a game where Ukraine could be used as a pawn to demonstrate strength. Meanwhile, leaks in the U.S. media suggested that nothing in Trump's formula did not mean inaction at all. Rather, it was a subtle hint at a covert operation, perhaps diplomatic, perhaps economic, that could be presented as a victory without visible hard measures. Such scenarios were eagerly embraced by conspiracy theorists, convinced that Trump and Putin were playing a complex game, where open threats served only as cover for secret agreements. Interestingly, the day after Trump's statement, a plane believed to belong to a Russian oligarch under Western sanctions was spotted in Geneva. Its arrival in Switzerland was never officially confirmed, but in diplomatic chat groups, the event caused a stir. One insider version suggested that it was precisely through such figures that messages and signals might be exchanged, while official channels were overloaded with public statements and media effects. In those days, while the official agenda was saturated with loud words and declarations, a far more delicate and tense confrontation was unfolding in the shadows. Several sources in European intelligence claimed that secure communication between Washington and Moscow was being used not only to exchange formal notes, but also to pass encrypted instructions to handlers in third countries. These instructions concern not just diplomatic wording, but concrete actions, the movement of goods, financial transactions, and information leaks meant to play a role in the upcoming decision. At the same time in London, so-called unofficial intermediaries became more active, figures from business and political circles who had long lived in the gray zone between legitimate negotiations and closed deals. One such intermediary, a former financier with extensive ties in the oil and gas sector, admitted under conditions of full anonymity that late last week he had received a request to arrange a confidential meeting between representatives of a major American corporation and a Russian state-owned company under sanctions. The meeting venue, a private mansion near Oxford, with strictly controlled access. Within the U.S., the confrontation between hardliners and those who believed Trump was merely playing to the crowd was intensifying. Several Republican senators bluntly stated in private that the 2-week deadline was a distraction meant to seize the initiative from the current president. But in other offices, the idea was seen as preparation for a precision strike on Russia's financial system, one that could be delivered without fanfare, but with the effect of a bombshell. Insiders from the former president's circle spoke of a series of closed-door meetings at his residence, attended only by the most trusted individuals. According to them, the atmosphere was almost conspiratorial. Phones were surrendered at the entrance, discussions took place with noise generators running, and documents containing preliminary scenarios were destroyed immediately after reading. At one such meeting, a source claimed there was discussion of synchronizing economic measures with an information campaign capable of drastically changing global perceptions of the conflict. Meanwhile, in Moscow, figures known in Russian political circles as grey negotiators became more active. These individuals hold no official positions but have access to the highest levels of power. Their task is to test the waters, send signals, and build networks of informal contacts. In recent days, they had been appearing more often in traditionally neutral countries, from Finland to the United Arab Emirates. There, too, meetings were recorded with representatives of international lobbying structures specializing in sanctions regulation and shadow schemes for circumventing trade restrictions. In the press, this looked like a series of coincidences, but for those familiar with the mechanics of world politics, coincidences in such moments do not exist. Within diplomatic corps and intelligence communities, the sense was growing that the decision Trump had promised to announce in 2 weeks had, in fact, already been made, and that the current moment was not about discussion, but about preparing for its implementation. The only question was whether it would be presented to the world as a sudden move, or as the result of a series of secret compromises reached in the half-light of closed halls and guarded mansions. In the last days before the deadline, events began to develop with frightening synchronicity, as if some invisible hand were conducting a global chess game. Simultaneously, in 3 capitals, Washington, Moscow, and Brussels, leaks began to appear, strangely coinciding in meaning. The American press hinted at an unprecedented trade initiative that could once and for all change the dynamics of the conflict. In Moscow, anonymous channels spread rumors of readiness for an asymmetric response to possible new tariffs. And in Europe, anxious analytical notes circulated in which the word crisis appeared more often than in all previous months. During the same period, journalists' attention was drawn to the movements of several private jets belonging to influential figures from both countries. One flight, from Florida to Reykjavik, another, from St. Petersburg to Belgrade, a third, from Zurich to an unknown destination. None of these flights was officially explained, but aviation watchers noted that such routes often coincide with closed-door talks on neutral territory. Within the U.S., sources close to the former president said the atmosphere was heating up. In his Mar-a-Lago residence, where advisors and trusted business partners gathered, There was a sense of an approaching climax. One participant described the situation as war room work before a shot that's already loaded, but the trigger hasn't been pulled yet. In those rooms, everything was discussed, from scenarios of immediate sanctions to the possibility of starting tariff pressure with a gradual increase in rates. One version even considered a combined move, economic and diplomatic at the same time, which could be presented as a breakthrough in negotiations. Meanwhile, in Kiev and Moscow, lower-level officials were trying to prepare for any outcome. Some bet that Trump was bluffing and that the real measures would be softer than the promises. Others, on the contrary, urged their leadership to prepare for a hard blow that could instantly reshape the map of economic relations. Inside diplomatic missions, intense consultations were underway, but no one could say with certainty which way the pendulum would swing. In the press, words like turning point, shock, and moment of truth appeared with increasing frequency. Political commentators debated whether this two-week intrigue might mark the beginning of a new era in international relations, one in which public statements become finely calculated elements of a global deal. And those accustomed to reading between the lines noticed in Trump's words strange slips hinting that he already knew what the next move would be. And then, just hours before the deadline, the world froze in anticipation. Markets stood still. Diplomats didn't leave their phones. Journalists didn't take their eyes off their screens. No one knew what would be heard in the final address. The promised massive sanctions, the threat of massive tariffs, an unexpected nothing, or something no one had even imagined. Into this silence, full of nervous signals and held breath, wove only one feeling, that behind the scenes everything had already been decided, and what would be said would merely be a beautiful shell for a deal struck long before the world knew of it.